Hello, everyone. My name is Sharnice Peters. I am a program analyst for the Division of Energy Assistance within the Office of Community Services. On behalf of OCS, I'd like to wish you a Happy New Year and welcome you to today's webinar providing a 60-minute review of Module 1 of the FY 2021 Performance Data Form, which is the Grantee Survey module. Today's webinar will be presented by Melissa Torgerson of Burb Associates and Dan Bausch from Apprise. Next slide, please. Today's webinar is the first of several planned webinars that will be conducted to review the reporting requirements for the fiscal year 2021 Performance Data Form. Today's webinar will focus exclusively on Module 1 and the Grantee Survey reporting requirements. This webinar has four purposes. First, this webinar will furnish an update on the status of the Performance Data Form. Second, this webinar will provide an overview of Module 1 to explain the purpose and goals of providing information on sources and uses of funds. Third, this webinar will explain how to report on supplemental funds, including ARPA and CARES Act funds. Finally, this webinar will highlight key reminders and ways to avoid common reporting issues in the Grantee Survey. The audience for today's webinar includes LIHEAP state coordinators and staff who have previously worked on the Grantee Survey. A second 90-minute webinar for newer staff or staff that want additional guidance will be scheduled soon. We greatly appreciate your time to join us today, and we hope that this is helpful as you prepare to complete your Performance Data Form Grantee Survey for fiscal year 2021. Melissa, please take it away.
Thank you, Sharnice. Happy New Year, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. We'll be spending 60 minutes during this webinar to review key information on the Grantee Survey portion of the Performance Data Form. The slides during this webinar are available for download now in the handout section of the GoToWebinar sidebar, and this webinar is being recorded and will be published on the ACF YouTube channel. Next slide. If you have questions during today's webinar, you're encouraged to ask them as we go along by typing them into the GoToWebinar question box. And there's a little picture here to show you how to do that. Submitted questions will be reviewed and responded to at the end of the webinar. And if we don't have time to get to them, or it's a very specific question for your state, we'll answer them directly following the webinar via email. This is a handy outline to have both right now, but also later if you decide you want to walk through these slides with your staff, or if you want to reference them as you're putting together the report. This kind of gives you a table of contents of the key topics we'll be discussing during today's webinar. And with that, we're going to start with a poll. And so we are asking folks, which of the following best describes your role and experience with Module 1, the Grantee Survey? Are you a LIHEAP coordinator that's experienced with the Grantee Survey? Are you a newer LIHEAP coordinator with limited experience? Are you a state LIHEAP or fiscal staff member who works on this report? Are you a contractor who helps complete the report? Or are you none of the above? If you all could take a moment, we would greatly appreciate it. How's it looking, Nicholas?
We have about 80% who voted. And I think we're not getting any more responses, so I'll go ahead and close the poll.
Great. Oh, so it looks like we have a really good mix today of coordinators and fiscal staff members, including some newer LIHEAP coordinators. So for those of you who may not get what you need out of this webinar, as Sharnice mentioned, we will be having a step-by-step webinar scheduled soon that goes line by line through the report. So hopefully this will answer a lot of your questions, but there is that additional resource available. So we're going to start today by just kind of giving you an overview of the Grantee Survey. The Performance Data Form is one report, and it consists of multiple modules. The module we're talking about today, Module 1, is the Grantee Survey. It's focused mostly on fiscal items from the LIHEAP program. Modules 2 and 3 center around performance measures and include both a mandatory section and an optional section. The Grantee Survey is a historic annual LIHEAP report that looks at your use of funds by assistance type. And there are really three main types of data that you're going to be reporting in this section of the performance data form. The amount of funds you obligated to different LIHEAP components, the average LIHEAP benefit amounts provided to households by component, as well as the maximum annual income limits for a four-person household by component. It's very important to stress that this is not an audit report. The Grantee Survey provides kind of a snapshot in time of how your LIHEAP funds are obligated each fiscal year, the average benefits, and how you're setting your income eligibility criteria.
Hi, everybody. This is Dan from Reprise. Thank you again for joining us and Happy New Year. I'm going to give you an update on the status of the performance data form and the Grantee Survey, how it's changed and how it's stayed the same since last year's Grantee Survey. So currently, the performance data form is pending OMB approval to renew that form. The form expired last year after the submission of your reports last year. And so OCS is going through the process of renewing that form, which comes up periodically. That process is expected to be completed very soon. And once the form is approved by OMB, OCS will be issuing an action transmittal with the due date and the instructions and information. So the due date historically has been January 31st, but it will not be January 31st this year. The due date will be later, as was the situation last year when OCS needed to get OMB approval for some changes to the form that we'll talk about. So the due date will be later, but you are encouraged to prepare the information for your grantee survey. And we'll be going over what information you need and what to pay attention to. Next slide. Okay, so first I want to go back to last year and the FY20 report that all states submitted. Last year, HHS revised the grantee survey to include new lines for reporting on the supplemental funds. And there were two main changes that were made to the grantee survey. In the sources of funds section, which is section 3, there were new lines added to show the amount of CARES funds you received, and lines that were added to show the amount of other supplemental funds that you could have received. The second change was that in the uses of funds section, section 4, the reporting on how you obligated funds to different types of assistance was broken out into separate parts so that you could report on the obligation of your regular funds, the obligation of your CARES Act funds, and there were lines that were reserved but not used last year to report on the obligation of any other supplemental funds that were released. Those were not open or editable in last year's report because during FY20, the only supplemental funds that were released were the CARES Act funds. But OCS added additional lines in the event that Congress issued other types of funds in response to the pandemic. So those changes were made for last year's report so that you could separately identify supplemental funds and how they were being used. Next slide. Taking us forward to 2021, as you know, in March, the President signed the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, and Congress appropriated $4.5 billion in supplemental funds for LIHEAP. HHS released the ARPA funds in May of 2021. you may or may not have obligated and expended those funds during federal fiscal year 2021. You may have also not done that and waited to use them until the current federal fiscal year 2022. When those funds were released, HHS sent out a Dear Colleague letter communication that announced the award of those funds and mentioned that you would need to track, account for, and report on those funds in the same way that was required for the CARES Act funds. Next slide. So the release of the ARPA funds during FY 2021 meant that grantees may have obligated assistance using 3 different pools of LIHEAP funds. You might have used your regular LIHEAP funds. If you had CARES Act funds that were remaining from FY 20, you may have used the LIHEAP CARES Act funds during federal fiscal year 2021. And you may have used the American Rescue Plan Act funds. So these 3 different groups of funds that are all relevant for your reporting in the Grantee Survey. Next slide. Okay, so for the current report for FY 2021, HHS has opened up the lines, the additional lines that were reserved for reporting on 1 additional supplemental funding type. And so you'll now need to report information on the 3 funding types that I just discussed, your regular LIHEAP funds, your LIHEAP CARES Act funds, and now the LIHEAP ARPA funds. There's some special notes here on the bottom of this slide. The first is that if you obligated all of your CARES Act funds during FY 2020, so you reported them in your last grantee survey, you won't have data to report on those CARES Act funds in this year's grantee survey because you already reported that information last year about the obligation and use of those funds. Similarly, if you opted or chose to not obligate any of your your ARPA funds until FY 2022, so the current federal fiscal year, then you won't need to report on the obligation of those ARPA funds in this report. You'll be reporting about that next year, and you'll instead report all your ARPA funds as being carried over to 2022. So we're going to talk about this more and show some examples in a little bit. Next slide. So besides the additional reporting for ARPA that mirrors the reporting you did last year for CARES, there have been some other minor changes to the grantee survey. In section 3, there was a minor change to add a line that's pre-populated with $0. So there's nothing you have to do for that line. It's just a line that's added in the event that there's a funding source available in the future. There's a line to report on CARES Act funds that were carried over into FY 2021 and were available for obligation. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. And your ARPA allotment that you received from HHS, has also been added as a source of funds. In section 4, there was also minor change made to remove lines that captured information that was already captured in module 2 of the report, the performance measures module. So those were removed. So these are just little minor items made to the form. The primary change to be aware of is that if you've obligated your ARPA funds during FY 2021, you'll have to report about how you obligated those funds. So as I mentioned, OCS is waiting for OMB approval for the form. Last year, because the form had been changed to add the CARES information and the ARPA information, and the supplemental funding information, Instead of submitting the report through the OLDC system, you were asked to submit the report using an Excel spreadsheet and submitting it on the Basecamp platform. OCS is anticipating that same approach of filling in a spreadsheet and using the Basecamp platform will also be used for this year's report. When the action transmittal is issued, it's anticipated that your liaison will be sending you the spreadsheet with your pre-populated funding information, and you'll be able to use that form to complete the report. Okay, now we're going to move on to the key concepts for reporting in the Grantee Survey.
So the first key concept is looking at the reporting period, which is federal fiscal year 2021. And this is from October 1, 2020 to September 30th, 2021. There are some nuances to take into consideration given this reporting period. You might have applicants that applied in federal fiscal year 2020 but didn't receive their benefit until 2021. Those should be included when calculating the average benefit amounts for FY 2021. Some of you operate your programs on a different time period, for example, starting January 1st or July 1st. But the data used to compile this report still needs to correspond to that federal fiscal year period of October 1 to September 30th. And that means that some of you might need to pull information for portions of 2 of your program years. Next slide. The guidance for reporting for the 2021 reporting period includes sources of funds, uses of funds, income eligibility thresholds, and average benefits. Remember, I'm going to say this probably more than once, but the Grantee Survey, for those of you who still remember what balancing your checkbook looks like, is a lot like balancing your checkbook. You're looking at the money coming into the year to spend, and you're looking at the money going out of the year. So sources of funds includes all funds awarded by OCS in federal fiscal year 2021 and funds that you carried into 2021 from federal fiscal year 2020. The uses of funds, you're going to be looking at how all of your 2021 sources in that first section were obligated or not obligated during the federal fiscal year. You're also going to be reporting on income eligibility thresholds. Those are your income cutoff levels set at the start of your FY 2021 program components, as well as average benefits. These are the mean benefit amounts for households that received their benefit in FY 2021. Next slide. The other key concept for reporting, and this is an enormous one, is the use of LIHEAP funds and obligations. The Grantee Survey asks you to report total funds for different program components, and this refers to the amount of your available funds that you obligated for each program component. The LIHEAP statute provides you all with flexibility in defining what constitutes the obligation of funds, and so as a result, many of you define obligation differently. Examples, some of you say the official designation of funds for specific purposes. That might be contracting it out to your subgrantees or setting it aside as part, encumbering it as part of an existing contract. And some of you may look at obligations and expenditures as one and the same. But obligations are not always the same as expenditures for many of you. Expenditures generally include benefits that are issued and paid. And in some cases, obligated funds aren't actually expended until after the end of the fiscal year. For example, some of you might obligate funds for heating assistance during the fiscal year to a subgrantee, but a portion of those funds might not be expended as benefits issued to clients until subsequent fiscal years. There was an IM put out very recently by OCS regarding the definitions of obligations and expenditures and how they relate to each of the funding sources you all are working with right now. And I encourage you to look at that and to talk about it with your fiscal staff and raise any questions you have with your liaison or give us a call. Next slide. The third concept to think about are carryover funds. And these are funds that a grantee does not obligate during the same fiscal year because you elect to carry them over or hold available those funds for obligation in a subsequent fiscal year. In the grantee survey, you need to report multiple carryover values. Remember, once again, we're looking at the money coming into the federal fiscal year and the money going out of the federal fiscal year. And so in this way, you're going to talk about carryover funds that you pulled into FY 2021 and were available for obligation. And you're also going to report on funds you didn't obligate during the year and you plan to carry forward into 2022. For the grantee survey, the amounts you report as being carried into FY 2022 should match the carryover amounts in your final FY 2021 carryover and reallotment report that was due December 31st. So if you need assistance submitting a revision to that carryover and reallotment report, please contact us and we'll help you out with that. This is a chart, Dan made this, and I think it's actually really helpful for you to maybe keep posted to your wall. This really helps to delineate and explain the carryover rules for each of the funding sources you're working with right now, as well as how they're integrated into the pieces of the report, both the sources and uses. So for regular funds, this is your normal base grant. Grantees can take up to 10% of those funds awarded in a federal fiscal year, and you can carry them into the next federal fiscal year. The way that this is accounted for in the grantee survey portion of your report is that FY 2021 awards are put in the sources, and any funds that you were awarded in FY 2020 and elected to carry into 2021, so this is money that you brought into 2021 as carryover, should be reported in the sources section of the grantee survey report. And then you're going to talk about how you obligated available funds during FY 2021 and the uses, and that might include carrying some over into 2022, and so you'll need to report that as well. CARES Act funds could be obligated during FY 2020 and FY 2021 only. So in this year's report, if you carried funds over into 2021 from 2020, they're going to be reported in the sources section. If you carried over funds to FY 2021, you're only going to be reporting on the uses of those funds here because you can't carry them forward into 2022. So we're not going to see any carryover of your CARES Act funds in the uses section, but we are going to see how you obligated them. ARPA funds could be obligated during FY 2021 and FY 2022 only. Your ARPA allotment is going to be pre-populated in the sources section for you, and you're going to report how you obligated funds during FY 2021, or if you carried over your ARPA funds into FY 2022. Hearing this over a webinar with just a voice is challenging. So if you have questions as you're walking through this, please don't hesitate to reach out and give us a call, and we'll help talk that through. Next. I think we're going to turn it over to Dan to talk about reporting on supplemental funds.
Okay. Many of you have been working recently on your household report. So I just wanted to provide you with a reminder and a comparison of how the household report differs from the grantee survey. So the household report is all about reporting on households that received LIHEAP assistance, that applied for LIHEAP assistance, and you're asked to report the total households, regardless of the funding source. Second, you're asked to report on the subset of those households that were assisted in some way with CARES Act funding. And third, you're asked to report on the subset of households that were assisted with ARPA funding. So you have three levels of reporting for each of the types of assistance. The grantee survey is focused on dollars, as Melissa said, the funds coming in and how you obligated those funds and provided benefits with those funds. So you're still asked to report at three levels, but they're different from the household report. You're asked to report separately for each of those three funding pools. So report information on the obligation of regular funds only, report information on CARES Act funds only, and report information on ARPA funds only. There's no fields in the grantee survey where you're reporting on the combination of those funds or aggregated amounts related to those funds, because we're focusing on dollars. If there's questions about this, be sure to reach out and we can discuss it and go over it. Next slide. Okay, so here's what section 4 in the grantee survey looks like. This is part A, which is reporting on your regular funds, also called non-supplemental funds. So you can see line 1 is heating assistance with your regular funds, non-supplemental funds. You report the total amount of regular funds that you obligated to heating assistance in that first column. Then you report the average household benefit for heating assistance using regular funds in the middle column. And then the column all the way on the right is the maximum income value for a 4-person household for heating assistance with regular funds. So this should look familiar from the past, and this is what you'll report for regular funds. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that the information you report for CARES Act funds, it's the same layout, it's all the same elements. So it should also look familiar from last year. And then lastly, if you look at the next slide, the way that you'll report on ARPA funds is also the same layout, the same structure, the same information, just focused in on each different pool of funds that you may have obligated during federal fiscal year 2021. Next slide. All right, so there's a need to report on each of those different funding types. So this slide provides some helpful information to help with that. So the first is, when you're reporting on the obligation of funds, you want to try to use your fiscal tracking information to identify which assistance types or categories you obligated each type of funds to. That should be information that you're able to get based on your records for the CARES funds and your records for the ARPA funds. You are asked to report average benefit amounts. So those are the amount of funds that households receive, the average across all households that receive that type of assistance and that funding type. To do that, you should identify the households that receive that type of assistance with some amount of the funding type. And then you could calculate a simple average household benefit using the benefit amounts those households received and dividing by the number of households. For the maximum income for a 4-person household, you want to look at your income eligibility criteria back in FY 2021 that you used for that type of assistance. And remember that this is a general report that applies to all states, but states have great flexibility in the design of their programs. And so you may need to have notes to help explain instances where the information isn't quite clear from the reporting approach, or you want to provide some context. So there is a notes field, and you're encouraged to use that to explain any nuances or any issues. And if you need assistance based on the way you obligated funds, or based on something that's new with 2021 that you haven't had to report on before, just reach out for assistance and we'll try to help you. Okay, so we thought it'd be helpful to go through some examples. So we're going to look at 3 examples with some different grantees, Grantee X, Grantee Y, and Grantee Z that we've made up. And hopefully one of these may seem similar to your situation, and just looking at this might be helpful for you. So we're going to start with Grantee X. Grantee X, during 2021, they prioritize their regular funds, and they decide they're going to be the case where they decided to wait to use their ARPA funds until later. Okay, so we're going to look at their funds awarded in 2021. This is the funds they got from HHS during 2021. Let's say they got $25 million in their regular block grant funds and $5 million that they were awarded for ARPA. So if we go down on the bottom, we have how we would report this information on the left side in section 3 under sources. Your report will be pre-populated to show that that grantee received 25 million in regular funds and 5 million in ARPA funds during 2021. Now we'll look at how they decided to use their regular funds. So for regular funds, they obligated all of their regular funds, which they prioritized, and they decided not to carry over any of those funds to 2022. So now if we look at section 4 in the bottom right, where they would need to report on their uses of funds, in the regular funds section, they'd be reporting 25 million obligated across the different assistance types that they had in FY 2021. And since they obligated all of those funds and didn't carry over any of them, they'd be reporting $0 as carried over to 2022. So they've reported about all of their obligation of those regular funds. Now we're going to look at their decision with CARES funds in the purple. They obligated all of their CARES funds before 2021. So they obligated them all in 2020. So that means they don't have any CARES funds available to obligate during 2021. So in section 3 on the left side on the bottom, we have $0 in CARES funds that are available. So their total sources that were available during 2021 are 30 million, 25 in regular plus 5 million in ARPA funds. So now how did they use the, for CARES funds, it'll be $0 for all fields in section 4 uses. So the last funding pool is their ARPA funds. They decided to save those ARPA funds and they didn't obligate any of them during federal fiscal year 2021. So under section 4, in the ARPA portion of that section, they would report all of their ARPA funds, 5 million, as being carried over to 2022. Now, when we add up everything in section 4, the total we get is 30 million. So you can see that section 3 adds up to 30 million, section 4 adds up to 30 million. So they have correctly reported all the funds that were available to them to obligate in 2021, and they've reported how they've used or carried over those funds in section 4. Now we're going to look at Grantee Y. Let's pretend Grantee Y used some of their ARPA and regular funds during 2021. So we'll start at the top with the funds that they received from HHS. They received 30 million in regular funds, we're going to say, and 7 million in ARPA Act funds. So under section 3 on the bottom left for sources, they would put 30 million as being available for regular funds and 7 million for ARPA funds. When we go back up and look at their decisions, let's say that for regular funds, they decided to obligate 90% of their regular funds during 2021, and they decided to carry over 10% to 2022. When we look at section 4 uses in the bottom right, since they obligated 90% of those regular funds, that would be 27 million, and they would have to report how they obligated those funds to which types of assistance. And they carried over 10%, which is 3 million, so they would report that on the carryover to 2022 line. Now let's look at CARES, what they did with their CARES Act funds. Just like the last example, they obligated all of their CARES funds before federal fiscal year 2021. So that means under section 3 sources, they had $0 in CARES funds available to obligate during 2021. So we put 0 there. So their total sources was 37 million. And when we look at section 4, the CARES section, they'll have $0 for all fields because they did not have any CARES funds available to obligate. Last funding pool is the ARPA funds. This grantee decided to obligate half of their ARPA funds during federal fiscal year 2021. So when we look under ARPA funds in section 4, they'll have half of the 7 million, 3.5 million split across the assistance types where they obligated it. And then they'll have the other half reported as carried over to federal fiscal year 2022. So again, when we add them all up, that adds up to 37 million uses, equal to the 37 million in sources. All right, last example we'll do quickly is, let's say that this grantee used all 3 funding types during 2021. They had all of them available and obligated at least a portion of all of them. So let's look at their funds awarded in 2021. We're going to say that they got 20 million in regular funds and 4 million in ARPA funds from HHS. So section 3, again, they'll have 20 million for regular funds, and they'll have 4 million for the ARPA allotment line. When we look at their decisions, we'll look first at their decision for regular funds. They obligated 90% of those regular funds, and they carried over 10% to the next year. So in section 4, the uses section, they'll have 18 million reported as obligated, and they'll have 2 million carried over to 2022. For CARES, in this case, they carried over 1 million of their CARES Act funds from 2020 into 2021, and they decided to use that for heating assistance. So for them, under section 3 sources, they would have 1 million reported as CARES Act funds carried into 2021. So their total sources adds up to 25 million. Now, if we go to section 4, they obligated that 1 million all for heating assistance benefits. So they'll put 1 million for heating assistance. And lastly, for ARPA, they decided to obligate all of their ARPA funds during 2021. So in section 4, they'll need to report on the obligation of all 4 million of those funds and report 0 as carried over. And again, the total for Grantee Z in both section adds up to 25 million, reporting fully on their sources and uses that were available. So we encourage you to look at these slides, to download them in the handouts and look at these more closely as needed. Now we're going to go on to some of the main reporting reminders for the Grantee Survey.
So as Dan just demonstrated, there needs to be consistency between sources and uses, just like balancing a checkbook. Your Grantee Survey should reflect how all of the funds you received, the sources, in FY 2021 were obligated or carried over in terms of uses. This means for each funding type, the total funding amounts in section 3, sources of funds, should match the total amounts in section 4, uses of funds. The following lines should match. Line 10 in section 3, the subtotal of non-supplemental funds, should match line 14 in section 4, which is the total uses of funds non-supplemental. Line 11 in section 3, the CARES line, should match line 25 in section 4, the total uses of CARES Act funds. And line 12 in section 3, your ARPA sources, should match line 36 in section 4, your CARES Act fund uses, or your ARPA fund uses. So in other words, if you are reporting you got this much money in for regular, this much money in for your CARES, and this much money in for your ARPA, we should see the same amounts going out in each of those categories. There needs to be some consistency with the household report in most situations. So data reported in section 4, your uses of funds, should match the types of assistance reported in your household report. So if you reported assisting households with say heating in your household report, you should be able to report the following for heating assistance in your grantee survey: your total funds and award funds, your average household benefit, or your maximum annual dollar income. Now, as we've talked about, obligations and expenditures are different, and each of you have different ways of designing and running your program. So if this isn't so in your report, say you obligated 0 for a type of assistance reported in your household report because maybe you obligated it all the prior year, or if you obligated funds for assistance and you didn't report any households for that assistance in your household report because you're not expending them until the next year, both of those are situations where it's going to look like a discrepancy, but a note will explain to us why that's so and give us the context we need to review your report and approve it. Next. Average household benefit. So the grantee survey asks for information on your average benefit amount for households assisted with each type of assistance. And so for each type of assistance, heating and cooling, as well as each funding type, the average household benefit should take into account all types of benefits provided under that type of assistance during the fiscal year. So in other words, some of you may give out multiple heating benefits, or you may have given out a supplemental benefit. Some of you do that later in the summer if you have remaining funds. All types of benefits that fall under the particular program component you're reporting on, heating, cooling, crisis, need to be accounted for in this average benefit. It's calculated by summing the benefit amounts across all households that received the assistance and then dividing it by the number of households that received it. You separately calculate the average benefit amounts for regular LIHEAP funds, CARES Act funds, and ARPA funds, just like you report on obligations. If the average household benefit includes benefits other than bill payment assistance, for example, some of you use heating assistance for furnace repair or replacement or tune-up, and if that's the case, we'd like you to include a description of the benefit types in the notes section of your report. The maximum annual dollar income. The grantee survey asks for information on the maximum annual or annualized dollar income cutoff for a 4-person household that was in effect at the beginning of FY 2021. The poverty guidelines that were in effect at the beginning of 2021 were the 2020 HHS poverty guidelines. If you had a LIHEAP program component, say cooling, that began after the release of the 2021 federal poverty guidelines, you may choose to use those 2021 guidelines in your grantee survey report. If you choose to do this, we would ask that you include a note stating this in the notes section of your form. If you provided assistance using CARES Act or ARPA funds, we want you to report the amount based on the income criteria used to receive the CARES or the ARPA benefit. Next. And finally, we can't reiterate this enough, the grantee survey includes a notes section because we know there are all different kinds of ways you run your programs. And so sometimes these reports feel like you're trying to shove information into a misfit kind of hole. And so the notes section really allows you to give us some concept or context of what you're reporting and have a better understanding of maybe some of the nuances of your program that we can't necessarily see in the numbers. And so we do use information both to review and approve your report, but we also use it in the report to Congress so that others have the context they need to understand your data. Don't hesitate to leave excessive notes if you'd like. To provide context about information that's out of the ordinary or just to give us clarification. Some examples of when we see notes added or when you could add a note include if a large amount of funds are obligated to a category, but only a few households were served with that assistance during FY 2021 because funds were not expended until later. Or if your carry amounts don't match your carryover report, that's another reason to include a note. Data validation and checks. Let's talk about this. Dan?
Okay, so there are a few steps that have been taken to try to assist you with completing the grantee survey and make the job a little bit easier. The first is that some of the values are pre-populated based on OCS's records of the funding awards or other information. And so when that's possible, those have been pre-populated. For example, the amount in block grant funds you received or your ARPA allotment will be pre-populated. And so you just need to check that those are consistent with your records. Some information about your carryover amounts will also be pre-populated, and those are editable if something has changed so that you can update those. When I was going through the examples earlier, I showed you how Section 3 added up to a certain amount and Section 4 added up to a certain amount. The grantee survey has lines that do that for you, so you can refer to those lines and see if your total sources of funds is equaling your total uses, or you might find that something's missing or one is higher than the other. So those are also included in the form as a way to assist you. Once you complete your grantee survey and submit it, Apprise will be reviewing it, and we do a few different steps in our review. These are meant to help you. It's very easy to accidentally make a typo or miss a piece of information. So we check it to make sure that there's nothing like that, and to also make sure that there's a complete understanding of the information you've reported. So there's a few checks that we do. One is we look at the data in the grantee survey to see if it's internally consistent. For example, sources equaling uses, or information matching across different sections that we would expect to match. Second, we verify that the data you report matches what you've said in the notes and other reports. So if in your household report, you reported that a large number of households got cooling assistance, we would look at your grantee survey to see that you obligated funds to cooling assistance and reported the average benefit and so forth for cooling assistance. Otherwise, we might ask you about that. Another example is that if in the notes you've mentioned something specific about weatherization, but in the report itself there is no information about funds being obligated for weatherization, we would ask you about that to make sure that the note was correct and not an old note. So we do look at the notes carefully to make sure that we understand all the information that you brought to OCS's attention. And then lastly, the CARES and ARPA information, since that's newer and something that you may have not reported previously, we'll be looking at that to make sure that that it matches our understanding from your other reports about how you elected to utilize those supplemental funds. After our review, we'll send you an email with any questions. You can always call us to talk about anything. And once your report is confirmed as complete, you'll be notified and told that the report's considered complete. All right, now we're going to do some final reminders before we take some questions. Okay, so the grantee surveys, module 1 of the performance data form. There haven't been any major changes to the grantee survey in terms of its structure or its layout or how it looks. The main change from last year's report is that you will need to report on your obligation or carrying over of ARPA funds during federal fiscal year 2021, in the same way that you had to report about the CARES Act funds last year. I noted some additional minor changes that were made that don't really impact reporting, but we wanted to note them for you. Lastly, OCS is waiting for OMB approval to renew and reinstate the form. Once that happens, there'll be an action transmittal issued with the revised due date and instructions. and that new due date will be after January 31st. This last slide includes links to different resources that might be helpful for you with the grantee survey. So if you download the slides, you should be able to click on these or copy them into your browser. There is a page on the LIHEAP Performance Management website about the required LIHEAP reports with information on each report. There's a check before you submit document that talks about things you can look at in your grantee survey to make sure it's consistent and correct. You can look at the instructions and action transmittal from last year. You can also get your own grantee survey data from last year or going all the way back to 2000 in the LIHEAP data warehouse. And the poverty guideline information that Melissa talked about earlier, there's a link to those poverty guidelines. All right, we're going to go to a poll now. We want to know, how confident are you that you understand how to correctly complete the federal fiscal year 2021 grantee survey? Very confident, somewhat confident, not too confident, not at all confident. This is anonymous, so you can answer it, and this helps us to know how we can improve the training. How's it looking, Nicholas?
It looks like the responses have stopped coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and close it.
Okay. Okay, so we have somewhat confident, being about 2/3 of people, very confident, 1/3. 1 or 2 might be not too confident. If you're in that camp, you can reach out to us and we can talk through any questions you have or what you might need to be more confident. And as Melissa mentioned, we have another webinar that we're planning for the grantee survey that will go into more detail as well. All right, we can close the poll. So we will be having this additional webinar. You'll be receiving information to register for that soon. Next slide. We have here different staff you can reach out to if you have questions, and also of course your liaison with OCS, who can help you with reporting extensions, reporting issues, OLDC access. All right, now we're going to take some questions. So if you have a question, again, you can submit it in the question box. That should be on the GoToWebinar box. That's probably on the right side of your screen. If there's something that comes up that you want to ask outside of the webinar, you can email us as well. And if we don't answer your question today, we'll send you an email to answer your question. So Nicholas, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. So one of the first questions we received was, just to be clear, if we had to restate our FY 2020 LIHEAP household report to show 2021 expenditures because it was obligated in 2020, is it correct to say there should not be any CARES activity on the FY 2021 PMR report?
I think if I understood it correctly, we can also follow by email. But I think if you obligated your CARES funds in 2020, then you don't have to report information on those CARES funds in the 2021 grantee survey, since you reported on them in last year's grantee survey. I think that's the simple answer, but we'll also I'll look at your question and send you a follow-up email as well.
And one other question was, what if the fiscal year for my state is different than the federal fiscal year from October 1st to September 30th?
I'll take this one. So we mentioned this at the beginning of the webinar. Some of you are going to be crossing over your own program years in order to have to submit this report. And so you will have to pull data for the federal fiscal year for this report, which is October 1 to September 30. And that might mean you pulling from 2 different sets of data in order to get what you need to complete this report. If you need help with that, please don't hesitate to reach out and we'll assist.
Another question was, if I used all of my CARES Act funds in 2020, do I need to report it again for 2021?
So one important reminder is when we're talking about the Grantee Survey, the main focus on reporting the dollar amounts of funds is on obligation. So there's lots of different variation, but if you obligated all of your CARES Act funds in FY20, you reported that information in FY20, so you wouldn't report it in the FY21 form. It's very likely that many of you obligated some of the funds in 2020 and carried over some of the funds to 2021. So in the 2021 report, you'd be focusing on those carried over funds and explaining how you obligated them, the average benefits provided, and the maximum income level for a 4-person household.
Another question was, could you go over again what CARES info is needed in Section 3 since we didn't get CARES in 2021?
Yeah, so the Section 3 is the sources of funds. So because the CARES allotments were in 2020, for this grantee survey, the only source of CARES Act funds you would have is funds that you carried over from 20 to 21. So in your reports, that'll be pre-populated for you based on what you reported last year. And you'll just need to check that that's correct and matches your records, or you can update it as needed to do that. So we encourage you, based on how you used your CARES Act funds, just to make sure it looks consistent, and maybe to look back at last year's report as well as you begin the process for this year's report.
Another question was, do we calculate average benefits separately for each funding type?
Yeah,
so for Melissa, maybe I'll let you talk about average benefits by funding type a little bit.
Yeah, as we mentioned, the grantee survey is a little bit more straightforward than the household report in that there are 3 distinct sections. One for your regular LIHEAP, base grant, your other is for your CARES money, and your other is for your ARP funds. And so in each of those sections, you'll need to calculate the average benefit based on that funding source.
And another question was, we obligated ARPA in 2021, but didn't spend most of it. How do we report things like average benefit, max income, etc.?
Yeah, this is, there's going to be all kinds of variations with how people time the usage of the fund and the obligation of the funds. So I'd look first at last year and how you reported the obligation and the average benefits and those items, and then reach out with questions about reporting this year or looking again at last year's report. There's just differences based on how the states approach that, and I want to make sure we don't give the wrong guidance that people misunderstand. One other thing I thought of that I wanted to point out for people was there was an OLDC issue right before the new year related to the household report, where it wasn't allowing people to submit their reports. That has been corrected by OCS now. So if you were waiting and have your household report but haven't submitted it, you should be able to go in to OLDC and submit it now. And if you're hitting any barriers with that, reach out to your liaison or contact us and we'll help you with that. I think it's time to wrap it up. So if you have any other questions, just reach out to us Any last words, Melissa?
No, just thanks for joining us, and don't hesitate to contact us if you need help.
All right, thank you for your time today, and we look forward to talking to you and seeing you again soon.